Service combat.
Awkward light special
Combat. Clear personal airline.
The modern supercarrier. Ship of controversy. The most complicated and awesome weapons system on the seas. A single carrier contains more firepower than all the bombs dropped on Europe during World War II. She is manned by more than 6,000 sailors. She has a flight deck larger than 4 football fields and is driven by nuclear reactors to achieve a range of 1 million nautical miles. A self-contained city and mobile air base, the supercarrier supports an air group of more than 90 aircraft, which are assigned roles that include air defense, attack, reconnaissance, and airborne early warning. Some of the air group are divided into 2 squadrons of 12 fighters, whose principal purpose is air defense for the carrier. The 24 fighters also provide cover for the strike force, which consists of 34 aircraft, while 16 others provide an anti-submarine defense. The rest function as recon, tankers, electronic signal jammers, and early warning for defense of the carrier, the long-range eyes and ears of the task force. For without adequate defenses, the supercarrier loses its effectiveness. A ship of controversy, the most expensive military weapon the world has ever known. Are they necessary? Could other ships, other weapons provide a more cost-efficient defense? Could Air Force long-range bombers be more effective? Would carriers be useful in a nuclear war? Are they vulnerable to attack? The debate over carriers has been shaped by these questions, both strategic and economic. From her inception at the end of World War II through Korea and Vietnam and into modern times, the supercarrier had to prove herself in a variety of missions. Nuclear deterrent, limited warfare, retaliatory strikes against terrorism, and in regional conflicts. The supercarrier debate began the moment the ship was conceived. The need for the supercarrier was born with the detonation of the first atomic bomb. World War II was over, and the U.S. Navy was at a crossroads. It had just won the largest naval war in history, and now stood unchallenged in the oceans of the world. The aircraft carriers of the American fleet were a key reason for its success. But that very success now worked against the Navy. Without an ocean-going adversary, it was difficult to justify the maintenance of the huge wartime fleet. Top strategic priorities were the atomic bomb and the rise of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had expanded into Eastern Europe and sought to solidify its influence by isolating and controlling new client states, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, and others, ultimately ordering the infamous Berlin blockade. Although Congress was well aware of the Soviet threat, the United States economy was still recovering from World War. A massive military buildup was not financially feasible. President Truman realized that the United States needed to develop a delivery system for its supply of atomic weapons. The Soviets had to be convinced that American A-bombs could be carried to their soil. But due to the limited number of the newly developed bombs, only one service, the Air Force or the Navy, would be selected to become the main delivery service for the supply of the atomic superweapons. The top brass in the Air Force and the Navy fought hard for the prestigious assignment. The atomic bombs of the period were large and bulky. They required huge planes to carry them. World War II carriers were too small to handle the heavy planes, so the Navy proposed a revolutionary class of huge aircraft carriers to do the job, the United States class, almost twice the weight of existing carriers. But the Air Force proposed the construction of a revolutionary bomber, the B-36, which the Air Force claimed could deliver the same nuclear punch at half the cost of the Navy's proposed carriers.
The smoldering feud between the Navy and Air Force bursts into the open before the House Armed Services Committee in Washington.
Inter-service rivalry between the Navy and the Air Force raged out of control and shocked the nation. At one point, a naval aviator offered to shoot down an Air Force B-36 to prove that it was the Titanic of the skies. The Air Force plan centered exclusively around a nuclear war with Russia. The Navy countered that America had to prepare for both nuclear and conventional warfare. In July of 1948, construction of the USS United States was approved. The keel for the ship was laid in April 1949. But that wasn't the end of the controversy. President Truman continued to fight with Congress. The entire defense establishment was reorganized. A new cabinet position was created. Lewis Johnson became the first Secretary of Defense. Citing budgetary reasons, he canceled the USS United States, and construction began on the Air Force B-36. The supercarrier had faced her first challenge, a political battle, and lost. The great ship was never completed. In protest, the Secretary of the Navy resigned. By 1949, only 4 carriers remained in the U.S. fleet. But America would soon discover another important use for her existing aircraft carriers: limited warfare. Congress had fought against supercarrier construction. The Russians and North Koreans, however, cast a deciding vote.
Our century will continue in a moment here on A&E.
South Korea.
The forces of the United Nations are in Korea to put down an aggression that threatens not only the whole fabric of the United Nations, but all human hopes of peace and justice. If the United Nations yields to the forces of aggression, no nation will be safe or secure. If aggression is successful in Korea, we can expect it to spread throughout Asia and Europe and to this hemisphere.
In the initial days of fighting, the North Koreans overran most air bases in South Korea, effectively eliminating our superior air power. The United States turned to her floating air bases, aircraft carriers. The carrier's future would depend on her performance in that conflict. The first challenge was to operate in the harsh weather conditions in the Sea of Japan. The ability to operate unopposed, launching airstrikes at the enemy while just a few miles off their coast, proved the immense military value of carriers. For the next 2 years, Operation Strangle, preventing the flow of materials and troops to the front lines, became the primary mission of carrier aircraft. The military term is interdiction. Carriers are particularly well suited to this mission. From their offshore stations, carrier aircraft could strike behind enemy positions, cutting bridges, closing tunnels and rail yards, forcing the enemy out on the highway, shooting up his roads, forcing him to move at night, then lashing out with night fighters. Interdiction was an around-the-clock job. There was no rest for the carrier crew. During the Korean conflict, naval aviation launched 1/3 of all combat sorties and delivered more tons of ordnance than carrier aircraft dropped in all of World War II. Successful carrier action in Korea paved the way for congressional approval for additional carriers. There were design problems, however. Carriers then in the U.S. inventory, with their wooden flight decks and cramped hangars, were not suited to operate the larger and more complex jet aircraft that gave the flat top its formidable punch. The solution? Dust off the old USS United States plans. But changes were necessary to modernize the proposed supercarrier. First, borrowed from the British, a new flight deck design added both safety and efficiency to carrier operations. An angled flight deck converted the carrier's deck into 2 runways, one at a slight angle to the other. This allowed landings and takeoffs to occur simultaneously. And if a pilot missed the catch wire, he could accelerate and take off again without having to fly directly over the men and planes on the ship's bow. If he should lose power, he would land in the water alongside the ship rather than directly in the ship's path. Another design breakthrough was the steam catapult. Jets that need a mile-long airstrip on land need only a few hundred feet when launched by a catapult. Catapults work like this. Under the flight deck, steam from the boilers is pumped up to a reservoir, while the crew above harnesses a jet to the catapult. The steam from the reservoir is released, driving a piston weighing as much as a city bus down the shaft, throwing the plane into the air. When this huge slingshot is released, a shudder is felt throughout the ship. The first supercarrier, the USS Forrestal, was ordered in July 1951. She was named after former Secretary of the Navy, James Vincent Forrestal. Carriers proved themselves in conventional warfare in Korea, while the Air Force B-36, designed to deliver nuclear weapons, was of little use. Carrier mobility was the key to Navy success. They didn't need land bases. Although 4 Forrestal carriers were approved, Congress was still not willing to finance a significant carrier fleet. In their view, Korea was an aberration. Conventional warfare was a thing of the past. The supercarrier had yet to prove herself in large-scale combat. (1964). Communist North Vietnam wages war on the South. American carriers move into the Gulf of Tonkin. August 2nd. 3 North Vietnamese patrol boats attacked the U.S. destroyer Maddox.
We have learned at a terrible and a brutal cost that retreat does not bring safety, and weakness does not bring peace. And it is this lesson that has brought us to Vietnam.
In retaliation, 2 aircraft carriers were given the mission, codenamed Pierce Arrow, to attack North Vietnamese naval vessels and fuel storage facilities. From the USS Ticonderoga, F-8 Crusaders and A-4 Skyhawks joined A-1 Sky Raiders headed for the Vinh oil complex in North Vietnam. The Constellation launched her complement of Sky Raiders and Skyhawk jets to join the strike force. F-4 Phantoms would provide cover for the attack planes. No alarm was raised by the enemy as the combat formation converged on the fuel complex. Large storage tanks neatly aligned in a fenced enclosure. The Crusaders and Skyhawks screened down and loosened a fury of rocket and 20mm fire to put out the anti-aircraft positions. Then came the attack on the fuel dumps. 28,000 pounds of bombs and Zuni rockets were dropped in the Vinh oil complex. The attack was over in minutes, but the destruction was complete. Supercarriers had proved their usefulness. The iron fist of the 7th Fleet fell hard on North Vietnam. Meanwhile, on the home front, the supercarrier debate hit new heights as the cost for America's most recent carrier, the USS Enterprise, soared to more than $450 million, twice as much as Forrestal-class carriers.
Our century will continue in a moment here on A&E.
The Enterprise's high cost was due to her revolutionary new source of propulsion, nuclear power. The Enterprise was the first nuclear-powered carrier in the world. 8 big nuclear reactors deep inside the ship's hull powered the vessel at 30 knots. Nuclear power held many advantages over the oil burners. An old carrier could use half its fuel in just a few days. so oil-powered carriers had to link up with a tanker at least once a week. It was a great inconvenience to a carrier skipper to have his ship tied to a tanker's apron strings. Nuclear carriers didn't burn fuel oil. There was no need to refuel. Enterprise sailed for 3 years on her original supply of enriched uranium fuel, steaming the equivalent of more than 8 times around the world. Increased acceleration was another advantage of nuclear power. An oil-burning ship would take several minutes to build up enough steam to drive the ship at full speed. On the other hand, the Enterprise's first commanding officer, Captain Vincent Dupois, said increasing speed was as easy as stepping on an accelerator. Nuclear power also eliminated stack gas. Oil burners gave off smoke and a great deal of hot, corrosive gas, which disturbed the air in the glide path of landing aircraft, damaged the skin of airplanes, and got into cockpits and instruments. Controversy trailed in the Enterprise's wake. Critics charged that the nuclear-powered 74,000-ton Enterprise was too big and too expensive. But the advantages of nuclear propulsion were decisively shown during the Enterprise's operations off Vietnam. In 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder was begun when President Johnson ordered sustained bombing operations against North Vietnam. And the Enterprise played a key role. She operated nearly 100 aircraft, from fighter bombers and aerial tankers to recon planes. The Big E also carried a new system, the Integrated Operational Intelligence Center, which interpreted photographs and electronic intelligence. President Johnson authorized the first strikes against industrial targets in the Hanoi-Haiphong region. Chief target? A power plant which supplied 1/4 of North Vietnam's power. Carrier aircraft faced formidable obstacles. North Vietnam had developed one of the most dense air defense systems in the world, complete with a sophisticated radar network and surface-to-air missiles, known as SAMs. Carrier operations were also hindered by politics. Communist anti-aircraft and surface-to-air missile sites could not be attacked unless the enemy fired first. So as not to hit foreign embassies or government leaders, naval aviators could not attack targets within 10 miles of Hanoi. Of course, the North Vietnamese used these sanctuaries to stockpile mountains of weapons, ammunition, military supplies, and essential raw materials. They also became the centers of the air defense system that featured air bases filled to capacity with Soviet-built MiG aircraft and surface-to-air missile installations bristling with weapons. Against all these obstacles, the attack on the power plant began. Carriers Enterprise, Ticonderoga, and Kitty Hawk launched more than 100 planes. The flight deck was the carrier's noisy and dangerous center of activity. During the launch, hundreds of busy men moved about the deck. Red-shirted ordnancemen loaded bombs, rockets, missiles, and gun ammunition onto aircraft, while firefighters stood by with extinguishers and hoses. Blue-shirted plane handlers disengaged chocks and chains from tethered aircraft. Plane captains in their brown shirts helped aviators get strapped in and made last-minute inspections. Green-shirted catapult operators built up pressure in their steam-powered systems. And flight deck directors in yellow shirts guided the jets with their screaming engines onto the catapult tracks. When all was ready, these men gave the signal, and the aircraft shot out of a steam cloud and into the blue. In 3 waves, the aircraft launched from the 3 carriers pummeled the target. The North Vietnamese reacted with anti-aircraft fire and surface-to-air missiles. But the enemy defenses were overwhelmed. The mass attack wreaked havoc on the power plant. Flames engulfed the site. Oily black smoke rose hundreds of feet. Naval aviators showed how carrier forces could limit the enemy's war-making ability. Critics were quick to point out that despite the advantage of superior air power and nuclear-powered ships, Operation Rolling Thunder did not prove decisive. However, by severely damaging the communist transportation system, naval air power had achieved some measure of success. Supercarrier proponents agreed that Rolling Thunder could have been more effective, not because of incompetent pilots or inadequate equipment, but because politicians interfered with military planning. At times, President Johnson personally selected each target. Permission had to be granted before even targets of opportunity could be attacked. In one instance, a carrier pilot discovered a train near Hanoi transporting over 200 missiles. Authority to attack this lucrative target was denied. In the final analysis, whether carrier air power unleashed from politics would have been sufficient to win the war will never be known. However, aircraft carriers, with their global mobility, proved their usefulness in limited warfare. And the Vietnam conflict proved that Korea had not been an aberration. Despite nuclear weapons, conventional wars would still be fought. And when it came time to project air power on foreign shores, there was nothing equal to a supercarrier. By the end of the Vietnam War, the supercarrier, the ship born out of the failed USS United States, the ship that had survived countless political attacks, had become the cornerstone of the U.S. Navy. And the United States had become the only supercarrier-based Navy in the world.
Our century will continue in a moment here on A&E.
After Vietnam, in an effort to cut costs, the Carter administration fought to reduce the number of carriers to 6. An alternative to the large carriers was suggested, and the supercarrier faced a new challenge: smaller, lighter, cheaper carriers. Against the supercarrier fleet was Elmo Zumwalt Jr., who had once been the chief of naval operations. Zumwalt argued that the United States was a world island. Industry and trade of the U.S. depended on ocean traffic. Accordingly, the Navy had 2 missions. First, sea control, keeping the seas open for commercial and military traffic. Second, to apply military power overseas. Zumwalt proposed that the Navy needed high-cost ships such as the supercarrier to project military power. However, the Navy also needed a large number of moderate-cost, moderate-performance vessels that could be in enough places at the same time to control the seas. Zumwalt sought to reduce the number of supercarriers, relying instead on the new vessel. The Sea Control ship was to be a smaller carrier with a complement of 14 helicopters and 3 Harrier jets. Since the jets could land and take off vertically, no catapults or arresting gear were needed. The Sea Control ship was to cost $100 million, 1/8 the cost of a single supercarrier. The Navy experimented with the Sea Control idea from 1972 to 1974 by converting an assault ship, the Guam, similar to a Sea Control ship in speed, endurance, and air capability. Chief opponent of the Sea Control concept was Admiral Hyman Rickover, on the right, arguably one of the most powerful and controversial men in naval history. In Rickover's Navy, there was only one way to travel: first class, which meant massive nuclear-powered ships. Although Secretary of Defense James Schlesinger approved construction of 8 Sea Control ships, a powerful contingent opposed the plan as both too expensive and impractical. The project was abandoned. England, long on the cutting edge of carrier design, faced economic squeezes and changed its naval strategy. The Royal Navy began to retire her carriers and replace them with smaller vessels, similar in many ways to the American Sea Control ship. In 1982, the first combat test for light carriers came when Argentina invaded a British Crown colony called the Falkland Islands. While Argentina celebrated, an angry Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher ordered the Royal Navy to recapture the islands. If light carriers could prove themselves in this conflict, then once again critics would question whether supercarriers were necessary. The British war fleet, 100 strong, assembled near the Falklands. The war got off to a dramatic start when a British submarine sank an Argentine heavy cruiser. After the loss of more than 300 crew, the Argentine Navy sat out the rest of the war. But 2 days later, the Argentines exacted their revenge with a cruise missile, sinking the destroyer HMS Sheffield, one of Britain's most modern surface ships. The fighting intensified as Argentine pilots flew low to avoid radar detection and inflicted great damage. Six major British ships were lost. 10 others were damaged. If all the Argentine bombs that hit British ships had actually exploded, a third of the British fleet would have been destroyed. The Argentine Air Force also paid a heavy price, with 91 planes lost. In July, the British were able to recapture the island. But in the final analysis, the lighter carriers failed to prove effective. Many naval lessons were learned from the Falklands War. The small British carriers didn't have enough planes, and the planes it did have couldn't provide adequate air protection. Harrier jets for defense, 4 jets in each patrol, each equipped with only a short-range radar, were incapable of detecting the low-flying enemy aircraft. Had a supercarrier been present, few of the Argentine aircraft would have reached their targets. The smaller, lighter, and cheaper ships proved a false economy because of their high vulnerability. The light carriers of the Royal Navy could be destroyed from a single torpedo or missile. although critics have often charged that the supercarrier is too vulnerable. Had any of the 16 successful attacks against British ships instead struck a supercarrier, it would have failed to interrupt operations. Multiple hulls, armor plate, and redundant damage control systems are standard on the large U.S. carriers. Proof of the durability of the supercarrier came in 1967, when the Forrestal survived a disaster of major proportions. A massive fire started on the flight deck during preparations for a combat strike. Thousands of pounds of jet fuel ignited and several 500-pound bombs exploded, blowing huge holes in the flight deck and destroying nearly 60 aircraft. The ship itself survived, never losing its ability to maneuver nor even coming close to sinking. She survived, but it is doubtful that a smaller carrier could have. The Enterprise proved her survivability when a Zuni rocket accidentally streaked across the deck into a group of fully armed planes. Explosions tore large holes in the flight deck, but the Big E continued flight operations. The lessons from the Falklands War were not lost on John Lehman, then Secretary of the U.S. Navy. He campaigned for a 600-ship Navy, a substantial increase over the current 500-ship fleet. Lehman sought approval for construction of additional carriers to bring the total carrier fleet to 15. For Lehman, bigger was better. Air superiority is essential to modern warfare, and no ship but the large carrier can dominate the airspace within 800 miles. Lehman's arguments found favor with the Reagan administration. So the 600-ship Navy was built, including 13 supercarriers.
Our century will continue in a moment here on A&E.
Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan strongman, had been a source of antagonism for the United States since he first rose to power. Against international law, Libya laid claim to the entire Gulf of Sidra, far deeper than the international 12-mile limit. President Jimmy Carter kept American ships from crossing Gaddafi's line of death. But President Reagan reversed that order, and in August of '81, the Sixth Fleet crossed into the Gulf and the Libyan Air Force rose to meet it. Libyan aircraft were never able to get into firing position. The high-tech F-14s, with their 200-mile radars, maneuvered into firing position before the Libyans ever saw them. 2 Libyan jets were ordered to fire on 2 American fighters. The outcome was never in doubt. The Libyans fired their missiles in a head-on shot. The Tomcats evaded the missiles, rolled in on the tails of the Libyan fighters, and splashed them with a single Sidewinder heat-seeking missile. Still, Gaddafi returned to terrorism. So in 1986, Reagan decided to strike targets inside Libya. The Navy and Air Force would join forces to execute this assignment. In perfect coordination, carriers America and Coral Sea launched a support package of jammers, intelligence aircraft, radar aircraft, and anti-radar missile shooters to suppress missiles and guns. Fighters provided cover. The combined defense suppression the Navy provided defeated one of the thickest air defense systems in the world. Air Force F-111s were able to put their bombs on target. Gaddafi's headquarters, commando training sites, and air base. Navy F-A-18s and A-6s struck airfield and radar targets east of the city. Once again, when America needed to strike enemy targets, mobile aircraft carriers could deliver the punch. And unlike the Air Force squadrons based in Great Britain, the carriers didn't need permission from a foreign government to launch their planes.
This conflict started August 2nd when the dictator of Iraq invaded a small and helpless neighbor. Kuwait, a member of the Arab League and a member of the United Nations, was crushed. Its people brutalized. 5 months ago, Saddam Hussein started this cruel war against Kuwait. Tonight, the battle has been joined.
The first step in any battle is to seize air superiority. In the Persian Gulf, aircraft carriers faced their most significant combat tests since Vietnam. Iraq's advanced air defense system had to be knocked out. The U.S. Navy had far more aircraft capable of handling this mission than the Air Force. The Navy was therefore responsible for more than half of these special strikes. In naval attacks on Iraqi radar sites, EA-6B prowlers would jam radars and launch anti-radar missiles. If the radar shut down, attack aircraft would cluster bomb them. The attacking force would include aircraft assigned to kill surface-to-air missile sites. The attack on the Iraqi air defense system was a stunning success. Hussein promptly executed his officer in charge of the system. Removal of Iraq's air defense system cleared the way for a much broader air attack. The Air Force and Navy prepared a detailed bombing plan, codenamed Instant Thunder. Unlike Vietnam, Washington left target selection to the military. Under the plan, attacking aircraft had either a specific target or a designated kill box, a geographical area in which they could search out targets. Naval aviators struck electrical plants, oil facilities, water facilities, phone systems, petrochemical plants, and the Iraqi military industry. All told, 8 U.S. supercarriers saw duty in the Gulf. The air bases provided by the carriers proved useful for a variety of reasons. Compared to land bases, the carriers were free to roam the Gulf and consequently were more difficult to attack. Carriers were sovereign territory. Unlike land bases, their actions could not be dictated by foreign governments. Carriers enjoyed the ability to launch attacks from advantageous positions. Although the Red Sea is far from western Iraq, there were few bases in western Saudi Arabia. So the Saratoga and the John F. Kennedy were ideally placed to attack extreme western targets, such as crucial airfields and Baghdad. Carriers were closer to the southern end of Iraq than any airfield ashore. They could deliver very high sortie rates against Basra and the Republican Guard. The air campaign achieved its goals, and once again, large carriers proved their usefulness. In the entire air campaign, carrier aircraft accounted for 50% of all sorties. From its inception, controversy has followed the supercarrier. The concept for these gigantic ships was born in the atomic age. The first supercarriers found new purpose in limited warfare in Korea and Vietnam. The design was changed to accommodate heavier and faster supersonic jets. The carriers became nuclear-powered. Supercarriers have served ably when needed for a variety of missions, whether simply to show the flag in hostile situations or to project air power on foreign shores. While it is true that the United States possesses the only carrier-based Navy in the world, it is also true that the United States is the only maritime superpower. Most American allies and interests are on opposite sides of vast oceans. The supercarrier is custom designed to protect these interests. Her aircraft can reach 85% of the Earth's land area. And with lifespans of 40 and 50 years, these ships will be with us well into the next century.
Currently, the United States has more aircraft carriers than any other nation in the world. And as we've just seen, every president since Truman has, at some point in his tenure, called upon carriers to intervene in crisis. Given its record in battle, it will be interesting to see how military spending cutbacks will affect the future production of these tremendous ships. I'm Edward Herman for A&E. Until next time on Our Century.